She pressed her wedding ring flat against the counter with one finger. The last thing she owned. The last thing she hadn't sold. The last thing Thomas had ever given her. And she looked the shopkeeper dead in the eye and said the words that nearly broke her in half. "Just bread, please." The man looked at the ring, looked at her, then slid it back across the counter without a sound. She didn't move. Couldn't. 3 days without food, and the only thing still holding her upright was the part of her that refused to fall down in front of a man who wouldn't even look at her while he was turning her away. Then the door opened behind her, and everything changed. If this story already has your heart, hit that subscribe button right now and drop the name of your city in the comments below. I want to see just how far this story travels. Now let's go back to where it all began. Clara had not always been the kind of woman who begged. There was a time, not so long ago that she'd forgotten the feeling, when she walked into Morton's general store with coin in her pocket and her head held at the angle that said she belonged there. When she ordered flour and salt pork and molasses and paid without counting twice. When the shopkeeper, old Gerald Morton, said, "Afternoon, Mrs. Whitmore," with the practiced warmth of a man who valued a reliable customer. That time was 8 months dead, same as Thomas. She stood in the same store now, and Gerald Morton looked at her the way men look at problems they don't want to solve. She could feel it, the shift in a room, when a woman stops being a person and becomes a situation. She'd felt it at every door she'd knocked on in the past 3 weeks. The pastor's wife who'd offered prayer, but not food. The neighbor who'd said he'd look into it. The woman at the church auxiliary who'd pursed her lips and said there were others worse off, which was either a comfort or a cruelty, depending on how hungry you were. Clara was past the point of deciding which. She'd slid the ring off her finger that morning, standing at the cracked mirror above the wash basin in the room she'd been renting by the week, and now couldn't pay for. She'd held it in the winter light coming through the warped glass, turning it, studying it like it was someone else's ring on someone else's hand. Thomas had placed it there on a warm June afternoon 4 years ago, with that crooked smile he wore when he was trying not to cry. He'd said, "I'm going to give you everything, Clara, starting with this and ending with whatever I've got left." He'd kept that promise, too, right up until the fever took him in September and left her with $43, a landlord's patience stretched to its final thread, and the particular kind of loneliness that lives in the spaces where a person used to be. The ring hit the counter. Gerald Morton looked at it. "2 loaves, Clara said. "I'm not asking for charity. That ring is gold. Real gold." Morton picked it up between his thick fingers, turned it once, set it back down. "I know it's gold, Mrs. Whitmore." "Then you know it's worth more than bread." "Worth more than bread in a city, maybe." He pushed it back toward her without meeting her eyes, and that was the part that stung. The way he couldn't quite look at her while he was refusing her. Out here, right now, with the drought and the cattle prices what they are, ain't nobody got coin to give you for gold, and I can't run this store on barter. I got my own debts. "1 loaf," she said. Her voice didn't shake. She was proud of that. "1 loaf of bread, and I'll work it off. Whatever you need done, stocking, cleaning, accounting. I got a boy for stocking, and my wife for the rest." Morton finally looked at her then, and she almost wished he hadn't, because what she saw wasn't cruelty. It was pity, which was somehow worse. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Whitmore. I truly am. But I can't feed the whole town." "I'm not asking you to feed the whole town," she said, very quietly. "I'm asking you to feed me." The door opened behind her. She didn't turn around. She stood straight, both palms flat on the counter, the ring sitting between them like a failed argument. And she breathed through her nose and told herself she was not going to cry in Gerald Morton's store. She was not going to give him that.
"What's the trouble?"
The voice was young, younger than she expected, and calm the way water is calm right before it goes fast. "No trouble," Morton said quickly. "Just a private matter."
"Didn't sound private."
Clara turned then. He was standing just inside the doorway, hat still on, a few years younger than her. She'd put him at 20 or 21, with the kind of lean, sun-worked build that said he'd never spent a day of his life indoors if he could help it. Dust on his coat, rope burns on his left hand, eyes that were doing a fast, thorough job of reading the situation, going from her face to the ring on the counter and back again, the way a man reads a map he needs to memorize quickly. "Ethan Calloway," Morton said carefully, like a man introducing a complication. "This doesn't concern you." The young man, Ethan, looked at the ring, then at Clara. "You offering that for food?" She wanted to say no. She wanted to pick the ring up and walk out with whatever was left of her dignity, and spend the rest of the day figuring out a different way. But she was on the third day with nothing in her stomach but rainwater and the bitter end of her pride, and the truth had a way of winning arguments with the body that the mind couldn't always match. "Yes," she said. Ethan Calloway reached into his coat pocket, pulled out a coin, and set it on the counter without looking at Morton. "Give her what she needs." Clara's hand moved before she could stop it, not to take the coin, but to push it back. "I don't take charity." "I know," he said. "That's not what I'm offering." She looked at him directly for the first time, and something about his expression stopped her. Not softness exactly, but seriousness. The kind that means a person is about to say something they've already thought through. "We need a cook out at Calloway Ranch," Ethan said. 9 hands, a foreman, my father, and me. Our last cook quit in February, and we've been burning beans for 3 months, and it is starting to affect everybody's personality. He said the last part without a hint of humor, which made it funnier somehow. And then she realized she hadn't felt the impulse to smile at anything in so long that the sensation surprised her. "Room, board, and wages, $30 a month to start. It's not charity, it's a job. You'd be earning every dollar." Clara stared at him. "Why?" she said. "Why what?" "Why me? You don't know me." "I know you haven't eaten in a few days, and you're still standing straight," he said. "That tells me enough." She looked down at the ring sitting on the counter between them. Thomas's ring. The one she'd worn every day for 4 years. The one she'd cried over for 8 months. The one she'd taken off this morning because she'd run out of every other option. She picked it up, slid it back onto her finger. Then she looked at Ethan Calloway. $30 a month, she said. "Yes, ma'am." "Room with a door that locks." A flicker. Something between amusement and respect. "Yes, ma'am." "And I run my kitchen without interference." "Wouldn't have it any other way." She nodded once, the way people nod when they've made a decision that scares them, and they're committed to it anyway. "All right, Mr. Calloway, you have yourself a cook." The wagon ride out to Calloway Ranch took the better part of an hour, and for most of it, Clara sat with her hands folded in her lap and looked at the prairie spreading out on either side of the rutted track, and thought about the specific nature of the choice she'd just made. She'd buried a husband. She'd been turned out of her home. She'd been turned away by the church, by neighbors, by men who'd tipped their hats to Thomas Whitmore every week for 3 years, and couldn't meet his widow's eyes when she needed them to. And now she was riding in a wagon toward a ranch she'd never seen, to cook for men she didn't know, because a stranger, barely old enough to shave, had dropped a coin on a counter and offered her something that felt, terrifyingly, like a second chance. She wasn't sure she deserved a second chance. She wasn't sure she trusted one. Ethan drove and didn't fill the silence with noise, which she appreciated more than she expected to. Most men, she'd found, got uncomfortable with quiet and tried to cure it with words. He just let it be. After about 20 minutes, he said, without any particular preamble, "My mother died last winter." Clara looked at him. "I'm not saying that for sympathy," he said, still watching the track ahead. "Just, you should know why the house is the way it is. She ran everything, the kitchen, the books, the hands. My father hasn't quite figured out how to run things without her, and the men can feel it, and it makes everything harder than it needs to be." He paused. "You asked why I hired you. That's part of it. We need somebody who can hold the inside of that house together while my father and I figure out how to hold the outside together." "That's more than cooking," Clara said. "Yes," he agreed. "It is. Is that a problem?" She thought about it honestly. "No," she said. "It's not." He nodded, and they rode the rest of the way in the same quiet. But it was a different kind of quiet now. The kind between two people who've said what needed saying and don't need to say anything else for a while. Callaway Ranch arrived the way truth arrives, all at once, without softening. Clara had built something in her mind during the ride. Not a fantasy exactly. She wasn't a woman given to fantasies anymore. But an expectation. A working picture assembled from Ethan's words and her own experience of what a functioning cattle operation looked like. A house that needed tidying. Men who needed managing. A kitchen that needed organization. What she got was more complicated than that. The house itself was solid, built to last, the kind of construction that said the man who'd raised it intended to hand it to his children. But it wore its grief the way a person wears grief, in the small, neglected things. The front steps that needed sweeping. The window that had been patched with oilcloth and never properly fixed. The front door that stuck in its frame because the wood had swollen and nobody had gotten around to planing it down. She cataloged all of it automatically, the way she'd been taught to assess a house by a mother who'd believed that you could tell everything about a family from the state of their threshold. What the threshold told her here was, people in pain, still surviving. The men in the yard stopped what they were doing when the wagon rolled in. She counted 6 of them visible. Another 3 or 4 would be out with the herd, she assumed. And they watched her, the way men who've been without a woman in the house for a long time watch a woman arrive, with a complicated mixture of hope and wariness, and the particular self-consciousness of people who've gotten used to nobody seeing them. "Boys," Ethan said, climbing down from the wagon box. "This is Mrs. Whitmore. She's the new cook. You will treat her with respect, or you will answer to me. And then you'll answer to my father. And then you'll have the distinct pleasure of packing your gear and walking back to Red Hollow. Are we clear?" A few nods, a few yes sirs. One man, older, red-faced, with a jaw like a shovel, just kept staring at her with eyes that were doing their own calculating. "That's Dale," Ethan said, low, just for her. "He's been here since before I was born. He's not unfriendly. He just takes time." Clara climbed down from the wagon without waiting for help. Not out of stubbornness, but habit. She'd learned early that waiting for help meant sometimes not getting it. And she straightened her skirt and looked at the house and made herself a simple promise. She was going to work. She was going to earn every dollar. And she was not going to think about Thomas or the ring, or the way Gerald Morton had looked at her like a problem he didn't want to solve. She had 3 days of hunger to burn off, and she intended to do it in somebody else's kitchen. The kitchen was a disaster. Not dirty exactly. It had been cleaned, after a fashion, with the kind of cleaning that men do when they want to say they've cleaned without actually cleaning. But it had been organized by people who didn't cook and had no idea where anything should go, which meant nothing was where it should be, and finding anything required a search, and the result was meals that were late and bad, because the person making them spent half their time looking for the pan they needed. Clara stood in the middle of it for 30 seconds. Then she started moving things. The cast iron skillet was on the wrong shelf, too high, too far from the stove, requiring 2 steps every time you needed it, when you needed it every 15 minutes. She moved it. The salt and the flour were in identical, unmarked crocks, which meant every hand who came looking for one grabbed the wrong one half the time. She labeled them with a strip of cloth and a stick of charcoal from the fire bucket. The onions were stored next to the potatoes, which was the fastest way to rot both, and she separated them without ceremony, moving the potatoes to the cellar basket and hanging the onions from the hook near the window where they'd get air. She found the beans, 3 bags of them, which explained the burning beans for 3 months, and she found a ham hock at the back of the larder that was almost past saving, but not quite, and she found dried chilies and cornmeal and lard, and she stood with all of it laid out before her, and she started cooking. Not because anyone had asked her to yet, because it was something to do with her hands, and because the men outside would need to eat, and because the act of making something, the particular attention it required, the way it pulled your mind into the present moment and out of the place where grief lived, was the closest thing she'd found to relief in 8 months. Silas Calloway came in from the range at sunset. She heard him before she saw him. Boots on the back steps, the particular heavy tread of a large man who's been outside all day and doesn't quite want to come in yet. The way men move when they're carrying something heavier than what's visible. He stopped in the kitchen doorway. Clara was at the stove with her back to him, stirring the pot that had been simmering for 2 hours, and she heard the silence behind her and didn't turn around immediately. Let him look. Let him take his measure. She was going to have to work with this man, and she'd rather have him see her working than see her startled. "You're the woman Ethan hired," he said. "Yes, sir. Clara Whitmore." She turned then, ladle still in hand, and got her first look at Silas Calloway. He was bigger than his son, broader through the chest and shoulders, with a face that had been beaten and dried and rebuilt by decades of weather into something that looked less like a face and more like a landscape. White at the temples, eyes the same color as Ethan's, but with 20 more years of weight in them. He looked at her the way a man looks at someone who's walked into his house and started rearranging things, which is to say, carefully, with a reservation he hasn't decided to voice yet. "My wife ran this kitchen," he said. "I know," Clara said. "I'm sorry for your loss." The silence lasted long enough to mean something. "How do you know about my wife?" "Your son told me, on the ride out." She turned back to the stove, not because she was dismissing him, but because the stew needed attention, and she'd learned that sometimes the best way to give a proud man room was to stop looking at him. "I'm not trying to replace her. I'm trying to feed your hands. Those are different jobs." Another silence, longer this time. "What is that?" he said finally. "Ham and bean stew with cornbread. I found the ham hock in the back of the larder. It was going to turn in another day or 2, so I used it. I hope that's all right." She heard him move. A step, then 2, then the sound of a man pulling a chair out from the kitchen table and sitting down in it. Not speaking, just sitting, like a man who's been standing for too long and has finally found somewhere he can stop. "My wife used to make that," he said, very quietly. Clara kept her eyes on the stove. "A lot of women make it," she said. "It's a forgiving recipe. Does well with whatever you've got." "Yes," Silas said. "It does." She served dinner at the long table in the main room, and 9 ranch hands plus a foreman, plus Silas Calloway, plus Ethan, ate the first real meal they'd had in 3 months. And the silence at that table was a different kind of silence than the one she'd walked into. It was the silence of people eating something that tastes like it was made by someone who cared whether they ate well. And it was, she realized, watching them from the kitchen doorway, the first time in a long time that she'd fed anyone. She'd been the one fed, or not fed, for so long that she'd almost forgotten what it felt like to be on the other side of it. It felt, unexpectedly, like coming back to herself. 3 days in, she met Rourke Talley. He came with 2 other men, drifters looking for short-term work, arriving at the gate in the late afternoon, the way men arrive when they want to be evaluated before full dark, but don't want to show up in broad daylight, where every flaw is visible. Clara was in the yard, checking on the sad, half-dead vegetable patch behind the bunkhouse. She'd already decided it could be saved if someone gave it attention, and she intended to be that someone, when she heard the horses come in. She looked up. The man who caught her eye wasn't the biggest of the 3. He wasn't the loudest. He was the one in the middle, on a bay horse, with a way of sitting still while the other 2 men moved around him that said he'd spent a long time practicing stillness as a kind of advantage. His eyes moved to her immediately, before he'd looked at the house, before he'd looked at Ethan, who'd come out to meet them, and they stayed on her a beat too long. She looked back down at the vegetable patch and kept working. But she'd been a woman long enough to know when she'd been filed away. Rourke Talley's voice was the kind of voice that came in smooth and left you feeling scraped. Easy, almost charming, with a softness that didn't reach his eyes. At dinner that evening, he ate at the far end of the table and didn't say much. But he watched everything. And what he watched most was Clara moving between the kitchen and the table. And she felt it the way you feel a change in weather before the clouds arrive. "Don't reckon I've seen a cook like this since Abilene," he said, when the table was clearing out. Clara was stacking plates. She didn't look up. "Fine stew," he said, like she hadn't heard him and he needed to try again. "Thank you," she said, flat and pleasant, and neither invitation nor insult, the tone she'd developed over years of dealing with men who mistook politeness for interest. "You from around here?" "Red Hollow." "That's so." He leaned back in his chair with the easy posture of a man who doesn't go anywhere until he decides to. "I heard tell of a widow woman in Red Hollow who tried to sell her wedding ring for bread. Some story." He watched her face. "World treats a widow hard." Clara set the stack of plates down on the sideboard. She turned and looked at him directly, and she made sure her expression said exactly what she needed it to say. "I see what you're doing, and it isn't working, and you should consider redirecting your attention." "It does," she said. "Good night, Mr. Talley." She walked back into the kitchen, and she didn't hurry her step, because hurrying would have told him something, and she had no interest in telling him anything at all. But as she stood at the wash basin in the kitchen, hands in the hot water, scrubbing a pan that didn't entirely need scrubbing, she heard Ethan's voice from the main room. Not the words, just the tone. Low and steady, and with a particular weight in it, addressed to the remaining occupant of that table. And after she found the ledger books on the 5th day, they were in the top drawer of the desk in the small room off the main hall that Silas used as an office. Except used was generous, because what he did with the room was more like avoided it, the way people avoid places where difficult things happened. The desk was covered in papers, receipts, notes in 3 different hands, none of it organized into any system that could tell you at a glance what the ranch had, what it owed, and whether the gap between those 2 numbers was growing or shrinking. Clara stood at the desk for a long time. She'd kept her late father's accounts for 4 years. He'd been a doctor in a small town in Kansas, better at medicine than money, and she'd learned early how to read the shape of a financial situation and how to make it legible to someone who didn't want to look at it. She'd kept Thomas's accounts too, for all the good it had done. Railroad clerk pay didn't stretch far, and a man's widow found out things about the state of his finances that the man himself had been too optimistic to name. She understood numbers. She understood the particular honesty of a ledger, which didn't care about your feelings and told you exactly where you stood. What she was looking at told her Callaway Ranch was in trouble. Not catastrophic trouble, not yet, but the slow, grinding kind that came from a drought year, with reduced grazing and cattle prices down, and expenses that hadn't adjusted to match. The kind of trouble that could be addressed if someone was paying attention, but would quietly become a different kind of trouble if no one was. She stood at the desk for a long minute more. Then she went and found Silas. He was in the barn, working on a harness, with the focused silence of a man who uses physical labor the way other men use drink, to put a wall between himself and whatever he doesn't want to think about. He didn't look up when she came in. "Mr. Callaway," she said, "I need to show you something." "I'm busy." "I know. This won't take long." She waited. "Please." Something in the please, its simplicity maybe, or the fact that she used it without apology, made him look up. She laid the ledger on the workbench beside him. She'd spent the last hour organizing the loose papers into a summary on a single sheet, the way her father had taught her. This much coming in, this much going out, this much owed, this much owned. And she put that sheet on top of the open ledger and stepped back. Silas looked at it. He looked at it for a long time without speaking. "The ranch hand's wages are 2 months behind," Clara said, carefully. "If you don't address that, you're going to start losing men, good men, who need that money and can find work elsewhere. And if you lose the men, you lose the herd management. And if you lose the herd management in a drought year—" "I know what happens if I lose the herd," Silas said. His voice was flat, but not angry. The flatness of a man who already knew all of this and hadn't wanted to say it out loud. "I know you know," Clara said. "I'm not telling you anything you don't already understand. I'm just saying it's manageable. Right now, it's manageable. There are things that can be cut and things that can be renegotiated. If you'll let me help with the accounts, I can lay it out clearly." He looked at the sheet again, then at her. "Why?" he said. The same question his son had asked her on the day she arrived. She was beginning to think it was a Callaway family trait, this habit of asking why, when most men would have just said yes or no. "Because you gave me work when I needed it," she said. "And because your son asked me to help hold the inside of this house together. I'm trying to do that." Silas Callaway looked at her for a long moment with those heavy eyes, and she had the sense of being weighed against a standard she couldn't quite see. Then he said, "Show me what you've got." She sat with him at the kitchen table for 2 hours that evening, going through the numbers, and it was the longest she'd heard him talk. Not about the ranch, not about the finances, but in the interstices, in the moments when the numbers opened into something else. He told her about the ranch as it had been 10 years ago, when there were 20 hands and the grazing was good, and his wife had kept a garden that fed half the county. He talked about the drought, the way men talk about something that's taken something from them, with the careful anger of people who can't quite find where to direct it. He didn't ask about Thomas. She didn't volunteer. But at the end of the 2 hours, when she was gathering the papers back into their organized stack, he said, quietly, "My wife would have liked you." Clara looked at him. "She would have argued with you about the kitchen," he said. "She had very particular ideas. But she would have liked you." Clara pressed her lips together for a moment. "That's a kind thing to say," she said. "It's a true thing," Silas said. "I don't say things that aren't true." He stood up from the table with the slow movement of a large man whose joints had started making their opinions known. "I'll think on what you've laid out." She watched him go, and in the quiet of the kitchen, with the lamp burning low and the ranch settling into night sounds around her. She reached under the collar of her dress and touched the ring on its chain. The one she'd started wearing that way, close to her chest, not on her hand. And she sat with the particular complicated feeling of a person who has spent a day doing something useful, something real, something that mattered to someone besides herself. It was not happiness. It was too early for happiness. But it was something. It was, she thought, the first day in 8 months that had felt like a day she was living, rather than surviving. And that, she would discover, was the most dangerous kind of beginning. The trouble with starting to feel useful was that it made you start to care. And caring, Clara had learned, was the thing that hurt you worst when it all went wrong. She knew this. She knew it the way you know a stove is hot even before you touch it. And still, somewhere between the second week and the third, she stopped counting the days like a prisoner and started counting them like a person who intended to be somewhere for a while. The ranch hands noticed before she did. It was Dale who said it first. Dale, who had barely strung 2 words together in her direction since she arrived, who ate his meals with the focused silence of a man who decided long ago that conversation was a luxury and sustenance was a necessity. She was out behind the bunkhouse in the early morning, working the soil in the vegetable patch she'd claimed, when he stopped beside her on his way to the barn and looked down at what she was doing. "You're planting onion sets," he said. "Yes." "Ground's hard." "I know. I'm loosening it." She didn't look up. "Inch by inch if I have to." A long pause. She could feel him deciding something. "There's a pickaxe in the back of the barn," he said. "Second peg on the left. Better than what you're using." He walked on before she could answer, and she sat back on her heels and watched him go, and felt something shift. Not dramatically, not in a way that announced itself, but the way a door shifts when someone has oiled the hinges and you don't notice until it moves without resistance. That was how things changed at Callaway Ranch. Not with speeches, not with declarations, with a pickaxe on a peg, offered sideways, by a man who didn't know how to say, "You belong here," but knew how to say it in the language of tools. She got the pickaxe. She broke the ground. She planted the onion sets in rows she'd eyeballed, with the precision of someone who'd grown up in a household where waste was not a philosophy, but a disaster. And when she stood up at the end of it, with her back aching and her hands dirty, and the morning still young, she felt, underneath the tiredness, underneath the grief that had become her permanent weather, something that was almost like satisfaction. Then Rourke Talley came around the corner of the bunkhouse and ruined it. "Early bird," he said, stopping just close enough to be deliberate about it. His eyes went to her hands, to the ground she'd turned, to her face, in the slow, methodical way he had of looking at things he was thinking about taking. "You work hard for somebody who's just the cook." "I'm not just anything," Clara said. She kept her voice level. She picked up the pickaxe and carried it back toward the barn, because she was not going to stand in a corner with this man and have a conversation she hadn't agreed to. He fell into step beside her. That was the thing about Rourke. He didn't grab or lunge or make the kind of obvious move that a woman could point to and name. He maneuvered. He got alongside you and matched your pace and made the space feel smaller than it was. "Heard you went through Callaway's books," he said. She stopped walking. "Word travels fast," she said. "Small crew." He shrugged, easy and loose, like a man with nothing to hide, who'd spent a great deal of time practicing that look. "Some of the boys think it's odd. Woman coming in, starts rearranging the kitchen. Next thing she's got her hands in the ranch accounts. Makes a man wonder what she's after." Clara turned and looked at him fully. "If the boys have concerns about how I do my job," she said, "they can bring them to Ethan or Mr. Callaway, same as anyone else." She paused just long enough to let it land. "Same as you." She walked into the barn and hung the pickaxe on its peg and walked out the other side. And she kept her breathing even until she was back in the kitchen with the door closed behind her. And then she stood at the counter with both hands pressed flat against the wood. And she let herself feel, for 10 full seconds, everything she hadn't let herself feel in front of him. Fear. Yes, some of that. But mostly anger. The clean, clarifying kind. She was not going to let a man like Rourke Talley decide what kind of woman she was allowed to be. She put the kettle on, and she started breakfast. And by the time the men filed in, she was herself again. Steadied, present, exact. And if her biscuits that morning were slightly better than usual, it was because anger, properly directed, made everything sharper. Ethan was the last one in. He poured his own coffee, he always did, rather than waiting to be served, which was one of the things about him she'd quietly catalogued. And he stood at the counter and looked at her with the expression he wore when he was reading a situation and hadn't decided whether to address it yet. "You all right?" he said. "Fine," she said. A beat. "Rourke bother you this morning?" She looked up from the biscuits. "How did you—" "Dale mentioned he saw you two talking." Ethan's voice stayed even, but something in it had gone careful, the way a man goes careful when he's deciding how much concern to show without making you feel watched. "I'll talk to him." "Don't," Clara said. Ethan paused. "If you talk to him, it tells him he has the power to cause problems," she said. "Right now he thinks he does, but he's not sure. I'd like to keep it that way." Ethan looked at her for a moment, with something in his eyes she couldn't quite read. Not quite surprise, not quite admiration. More like the recognition a person feels when they realize they've been underestimating something. "All right," he said. "But if it changes—" "I'll tell you," she said. "I'm not too proud to ask for help when I need it." "I know," he said. And then, quieter, "That's more than most people can say." He took his coffee and he left, and Clara stood in the kitchen and did not examine too closely what it meant that the opinion of a 21-year-old rancher's son had the power to straighten her spine. She served breakfast, and she didn't look at Rourke Talley once. He noticed. She knew he noticed. Good. The letter arrived on a Thursday. It came with the supply rider from Red Hollow, mixed in with the feed invoices and a seed catalog nobody had ordered, and it was addressed to Silas Calloway in the formal hand of a man who charged by the word. Clara set it on the desk in the office without opening it, obviously, and thought nothing more about it until that evening, when she heard the silence coming out of that office like something with weight. She'd learned Silas's silences the way you learn the silences of a house you've lived in long enough. Which ones were comfortable? Which ones were working? Which ones were the kind that precede a door blowing open in a storm? This one was the last kind. She knocked. "Come." He was at the desk. The letter was open in front of him, a single page, and the look on his face was the look of a man who's just been told something he already knew, and had been hoping wasn't true. "Bad news?" she said. He looked up. For a moment, she thought he was going to tell her it was none of her concern, which would have been fair, and she was already preparing to retreat. But instead, he picked up the letter and held it out. She read it. It was from the bank in town, formal, precise, the language of men who deal in other people's losses for a living. The Calloway Ranch had a note coming due in 60 days. The amount was not catastrophic, but it was not small either. And with cattle prices where they were, and the drought reducing the saleable weight of the herd, meeting it was going to require either selling stock at a loss or finding another way to raise funds. And the letter politely but clearly suggested that the bank was not inclined toward extensions. She set the letter down. 60 days, she said. 60 days! What are the options? Silas leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling the way men look at things when they're trying not to let the feeling show in their face. Sell part of the herd now, at current prices. Take a loss, but clear the note. Or, hold on, pray the drought breaks and the price recovers, and gamble that we can make the payment by fall. What's the third option? He looked at her. What third option? There's always a third option, Clara said. My father used to say that. He said the men who think there are only two choices in a crisis are the ones who lose, because one of them is always bad, and the other is always worse. The third option is the one nobody's looked for yet. Silas stared at her. Then, slowly, something in his expression shifted. Not softening exactly, but opening. The way a fist opens when the thing it's been holding is finally put down. All right, he said. What's the third option? She pulled out a chair, sat down, and they went back to the numbers. It was Ethan who found the solution, 2 days later, working off the foundation she and Silas had built together. The neighboring Hearst spread had water, a creek that ran year-round, but not enough hands to manage their full grazing range. The Callaway herd could summer on Hearst land in exchange for labor, cutting both ranches' costs and giving the Callaway cattle access to grass they couldn't get on drought-stricken land. It wouldn't clear the note entirely, but with the labor savings and the weight gain on the cattle, it would get close enough that Silas could negotiate with the bank from a position of something other than desperation. Ethan brought the idea to the kitchen table on a Sunday evening, laid it out with the same direct economy he brought to everything, and looked at his father and waited. Silas looked at the numbers Clara had updated. He looked at Ethan. He looked out the window for a long moment at the ranch that had been in his family for 30 years. Your mother would have thought of that, he said finally. She probably did think of it, Ethan said. She just didn't get the chance to tell us. The silence between them was the kind that carries more than words can hold. 30 years of a man's life. One winter of loss. The particular grief of fathers and sons who love each other without always knowing how to say it. Clara refilled their coffee and didn't say anything, because there was nothing to say. I'll ride to Hearst's in the morning, Silas said. Ethan nodded. I'll come with you. That night, for the first time since she'd arrived at Callaway Ranch, Clara heard Silas Callaway laugh. A real laugh, brief and rusty from disuse, in response to something Billy, the youngest hand, said at the dinner table. It happened so fast she almost missed it, but she didn't miss it. She carried it with her up to bed, the way you carry something fragile. She was teaching Billy to read by the end of the third week. It happened by accident, the way the most important things tend to happen. He'd come to her asking her to read a letter from his mother. He did this every week, and she'd been doing it without comment, just sitting down with the envelope and reading it to him in the kitchen after supper, and then writing the reply as he dictated it. And on this particular evening, he'd watched her hand moving across the page and said very quietly, like someone admitting something shameful, I always meant to learn. Clara set down the pen. Do you want to? She said. He looked at the table. He was 19, maybe 20, with a kind of face that hadn't quite settled into itself yet, and the particular pride of a young man who knows what he doesn't know and isn't sure whether to hate it or fix it. Seems like something I should have done already, he said. Everybody learns when they learn, Clara said. The time you waste wishing it happened earlier is time you could have been doing it now. He looked up. Start tonight? She said. He nodded, and they started. Within a week, 2 of the other hands had asked to join, and Clara was sitting at the kitchen table 3 nights a week with grown men bent over a primer, their faces serious with the concentration of people doing something that matters to them. Dale watched from the doorway one evening without coming in, and Clara didn't comment on it. And the following week, he pulled up a chair without being asked, and she handed him a primer without making anything of it. And that was that. Rourke Talley watched all of this from a distance that had become, over the weeks, charged with something Clara couldn't quite categorize. Not attraction. She didn't flatter herself with that interpretation. Something more calculated. Like a man who'd come in expecting to find one thing and found another, and was still deciding what to do about it. She felt his eyes at dinner. She felt them in the yard. She said nothing, did nothing, and waited. Because she'd grown up with a doctor father who'd told her that the two most powerful things a person could do in a dangerous situation were to remain calm and to pay attention. And she was doing both. The moment came on a Wednesday evening. She'd stayed late in the smokehouse, checking the cured meat inventory. She was updating the supply ledger now, as part of her regular duties, with Silas's quiet blessing. And she was listing the last of the hanging hams when she heard the door. She turned around. Rourke filled the doorway. "Thought that was you," he said. "Inventory," she said. She kept her voice flat and continued writing. "Late for inventory." "It takes as long as it takes." She wrote another line. "Excuse me, I need to get past you to leave." He didn't move, not aggressively, not in the way that would have given her something to name and call out. Just still in the doorway, in the way of a man testing to see if the door was locked. "I've been watching you," he said, "since you got here. Working your way in, kitchen, then the books, now teaching the boys their letters." His voice was almost conversational, which made it worse. "That's a lot of territory for a widow who came in looking for bread money." Clara closed the ledger. She turned and faced him fully. "Say whatever it is you're trying to say," she said. "I'm saying you're smart," he said. "Smarter than you let on. And I'm wondering what a smart woman with no money and no name left thinks she's going to get out of a spread that's 60 days from the bank calling in its note." The air in the smokehouse went very still. She hadn't told anyone but Silas and Ethan about the bank letter. "How do you know about that?" she said. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. Rourke smiled. It didn't reach those calculating eyes. "Word travels," he said. Exact echo of what he'd said to her 2 weeks ago. And the deliberateness of it, the message underneath the message, was as clear as anything he could have said out loud. "I know things. I pay attention. Don't cross me." Clara took one breath, measured it out. "You're wrong about why I'm here," she said. "But you're not entirely wrong that I'm paying attention. So I'll tell you something true, Mr. Talley, in the spirit of honesty between people who understand each other." She picked up the ledger and held it against her chest, and looked at him without flinching. "The Callaways know exactly how I got here. They know about the ring and the bread and every bit of it. There are no secrets for you to use. And the men in this crew, the ones you're thinking of working against them, would follow Ethan Callaway into a burning building, and they proved it to me before you even arrived." She let that sit for exactly 1 second. "Now, I need to get past you." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he stepped aside. She walked through the door and across the yard, and into the kitchen, and she latched the door behind her, and she stood in the dark with her back against it. And this time, she gave herself more than 10 seconds. She gave herself the full minute she needed. Then she lit the lamp and went to find Ethan. She told him plainly, without drama, sitting at the kitchen table with the lamp between them. She told him about the smokehouse, about the bank letter, about Rourke Talley's voice doing the thing it did when it wanted her to know she was being watched. Ethan listened without interrupting, which was a thing she'd come to rely on. This particular quality of attention he brought to things that mattered. When she finished, he said, "I'm going to let him go." "He'll say you let him go because of me," Clara said. "Let him say it." Ethan's jaw was set. "I don't keep men on this ranch who use what they know to back people into corners. That's not about you specifically. That's about the kind of crew I'm trying to build." "Your father?" "I'll talk to my father." He looked at her across the lamp. "You should have told me sooner." "I was handling it." "I know you were," he said. "That's not the same as having to handle it alone."
The directness of it caught her off guard. Not what he said, but how he said it. Like it was simply a fact. Like it cost him nothing to say it. Like the idea of her not being alone in something was as straightforward to him as the weather. She looked at the table. "You're 21 years old," she said. And she didn't mean it as a dismissal. She meant it as a question. The question underneath. Why do you act like you've been doing this your whole life? 22 last month, he said. And my mother ran a cattle ranch through 3 hard winters and kept 14 men fed and my father from losing his mind. And she did it like it was just what a person does. He was quiet for a moment. I know what capable looks like. I knew it when I walked into Morton's store. Clara pressed her fingertips to the ring through the cloth of her dress. Habit now. Reflex. The way she reached for it when she needed something to hold on to that was real. "Thank you," she said. It came out quieter than she intended. "Don't thank me," he said. "Just let me know next time." He left her in the kitchen, and the lamp burned down, and outside, the ranch settled into the sounds it made when everyone else was asleep. The horses moving, the wind in the grass, the particular quiet of a place that has survived another day and intends to survive the next one. Clara sat at that table for a long time, and for the first time since Thomas died, the silence around her felt less like absence and more like the sound of a life waiting to be inhabited. She didn't let herself think too hard about what that meant. Not yet. But the feeling stayed with her when she finally went to bed, and it was still there in the morning, and the morning after that, growing quietly, like something she had planted in hard ground, inch by careful inch, without quite knowing what she was growing. The fire would come before she found out. It always did. Rourke Talley was gone by Friday morning. Ethan had spoken to his father Thursday night, and Silas had listened without interrupting, which was how Clara knew he'd already been watching Rourke, and waiting for a reason he could name out loud. He paid the man his 2 weeks without ceremony, and Rourke took it the way dangerous men take dismissal when they've been outmaneuvered. Quietly, with a smile that meant something entirely different than what a smile was supposed to mean, and with a last look at Clara across the yard that said this wasn't finished, that it was, in fact, only paused. She held his gaze until he looked away first. Then she went back inside and made breakfast and didn't speak of it again. The 2 men who'd come with Rourke left with him. Birds of a feather, Dale said, without elaboration. And the crew that remained was smaller but cleaner, the way a room feels cleaner when you've removed the one piece of furniture that was always slightly wrong for the space. Nobody talked about it directly. Cowboys didn't. But the dinner table that evening had a looseness to it, a lowering of shoulders that said everyone had been waiting for that particular tension to leave and was relieved it finally had. Billy laughed at something Dale said. A real laugh, unguarded. Silas noticed. Clara saw him notice. He didn't say anything, but he stayed at the table 10 minutes longer than usual, and that was its own kind of statement. What Clara didn't say, to anyone, was that Rourke's last look had settled in her chest like a splinter. Small, invisible, but there, working its way in. She wasn't afraid of him the way a woman is afraid of violence. She was afraid of him the way a woman is afraid of men who feel owed, who decide that a thing they wanted and didn't get is a wrong that needs correcting. Those men had long memories and longer patience, and they showed up again in the places you'd stopped watching. She filed it away. She kept her eyes open, and she went on working. The arrangement with the hearse spread came through the following week. Silas rode back from the negotiation with the look of a man who'd gone in expecting to beg and come out having traded fairly. And the difference between those two things was visible on his face from 20 yards out. He told Ethan first, then Clara, and the fact that he told her second, rather than not at all, was not lost on her. "We move a third of the herd to Hurst's summer range in 2 weeks," he said, standing in the kitchen doorway while she was putting up preserves she'd made from the first harvest of the vegetable patch. "That gives us the weight gain we need and cuts the feed cost enough to make the bank payment without selling at lost prices." Clara set down the jar she was holding. "That's good news, Mr. Calloway." "It's your numbers that made it possible," he said. "Wanted you to know that." He said it the way he said everything, flat, direct, no ornamentation, and she understood by now that this was how Silas Calloway expressed gratitude, by naming the truth of a thing out loud and making sure the right person heard it. It was more, she thought, than most men offered. "Ethan's idea made it possible," she said. "I just laid out what the problem was clearly enough that he could see it." Silas looked at her with those heavy eyes. "That's not a small thing," he said. "Most people can't do that." He left, and she went back to the preserves, and she let herself feel the small warmth of it without trying to explain it away. That warmth lasted exactly 9 days. Then the sky turned wrong. She felt it before she saw it. A change in the air, a quality of dryness that was different from the regular dryness of drought, sharper somehow, with a smell underneath it that she couldn't name and then could. Smoke, far off, thin as a rumor. She was hanging laundry in the side yard when it hit her, and she stopped with a sheet half-pinned and lifted her face and turned toward the southwest. The line on the horizon was dark and moving. Her heart did one hard knock against her ribs. "Fire!" She didn't think about it. Her voice came out full and carrying before her mind caught up with her lungs. "Fire on the southwest ridge! Fire coming!" The yard exploded. Dale was running before she finished the second word, moving with a speed that contradicted his age and his usual deliberate pace. The speed of a man who's seen range fires before and knows exactly how much time you don't have. He was shouting for the hands by name before he reached the bunkhouse door. Billy came out of the barn at a dead run, saw the horizon, and veered immediately toward the horse corral. 2 other men appeared from the direction of the range and didn't stop moving, just absorbed the situation and changed direction like water finding its level. Clara dropped the sheet. She went for the water barrel first, the big one by the barn, the one they kept full as a ranch habit, and she started pulling the burlap feed sacks that were stacked along the barn wall, shoving them at the 2 hands who came running past her. "Wet them," she said. "Now! Wet them and get them to the east fence line." The men took them without question. She registered that. Later she would register it. That they took the order from her without hesitating, the way you take orders from someone whose authority you've accepted somewhere below the level of conscious decision. Ethan appeared at her shoulder. His face was reading the fire the way his father read the numbers, quickly, without flinching. "Cattle are east of the barn," he said, thinking out loud more than talking to her. "Wind's pushing it straight at us. We've got 20 minutes, maybe less." "The creek cut," Clara said. "If you break the fence at the creek cut, the cattle will move toward the water naturally, and the fire break is the bank itself." He looked at her. "I grew up near the Kansas grasslands," she said. "I watched my father help organize a fire response when I was 12. The creek cut will work if you move the herd now." "Billy!" Ethan was already moving. "Cut the east fence at the creek line. All of it. Every post if you have to.
Move! Billy didn't answer. He was already gone. Ethan turned back. Get back inside. No, Clara said. Clara, no. She said it the way she'd said everything that mattered since she'd arrived here. Without anger, without apology, with just the plain weight of a decision already made. You need every person you have. Tell me where. For 1 second, just one, he looked at her with an expression she'd never seen on him before. Something unguarded and almost afraid. Not of the fire, of something else. Something that had to do with her specifically. With the word no she just said. With a particular brightness that had come into her eyes that he seemed to recognize and not want to lose. Then it closed over. Wet line along the north side of the barn, he said. Keep it soaked. Don't let it get behind you. She ran. The next 40 minutes were the longest of her life. Not because they were the most frightening, though they were frightening, the fire's voice a sound she felt in her sternum before she heard it with her ears. The smoke thickening from suggestion to fact, to the kind of presence that got into your lungs and your eyes and made the world go small and orange at the edges. They were the longest because of what they asked of her mind. Not just her body, not just her hands on the soaked burlap, hauling and slapping and hauling again, but the particular quality of attention that a crisis requires, where every second is a decision, and every decision has a consequence, and you cannot afford to be anywhere but exactly where you are. She had not been this present, this completely, utterly, physically in the moment, since the morning Thomas died. That thought hit her between one motion and the next, and she let it hit, and she kept moving. Because grief didn't stop for fire, and fire didn't stop for grief, and the only thing that helped either one was forward motion. Dale materialized beside her at the barn wall, wordless, and they worked the line together. She'd hand him a soaked sack, he'd slap it against the wood. She'd pull the next one, back and forth. A rhythm that felt almost like a conversation, like two people who'd been working together for years. "Herd's moving!" somebody shouted from the direction of the east fence. She didn't see who. The fire reached the field. She heard it differently then. Not just the smell and the color, but the sound. A particular roar that had direction and intent. "Silas!" Ethan's voice, from her left, sharp with something she'd never heard in it before. "Dad's down! Barn beam! Silas is down!" Clara dropped the sack. She didn't decide to run toward the voice. Her body decided, and she followed. She found Ethan in the smoke at the corner of the barn where the old lean-to had partially collapsed, and Silas was on one knee with his arm pinned under a beam that had come off the lean-to roof. Not heavy enough to break bone, but enough to hold him, and the smoke around them was thickening by the second. Ethan had the beam lifted an inch, but the angle was wrong, and he couldn't get leverage without dropping it. "Don't drop it," Clara said. She was already beside him, her hands finding the beam by feel as much as sight. "On 3. Lift and pull him clear." 1. "I've got it," Ethan started. 1, Clara said again, flat and certain. 2, 3. They lifted. Silas pulled. The beam came up 4 inches. Enough. And Silas dragged his arm free, and Clara felt the weight come back down, and her shoulders screamed, and she let it scream. And she grabbed Silas's free arm and pulled. They got him clear. 10 feet, 15, far enough. Silas was coughing, hard, doubled over coughing. And Ethan's hand was on his father's back, and neither of them was looking at Clara. And that was right. That was how it should be. Because this wasn't about her. This was a father and a son, and 30 years of a ranch and a fire that hadn't taken it yet. She turned back toward the barn wall and picked up a soaked sack and went back to the line. The fire turned. It was the creek cut that did it.
Billy and two other hands had broken the east fence along a 60-yard stretch, and the cattle had gone for the water the way animals go for what they know. And the creek bank held the fire's edge the way Clara had said it would. And the wind shifted, barely, just enough. And the fire took the shift as its direction, and moved northeast along the cut and away from the structures. It took another 20 minutes to be sure. Clara stood at the barn wall and worked the soaked burlap until her arm stopped working properly, and she switched to her other arm and kept going. And then Dale put his hand on her wrist and said, "It's past us." And she looked at him and looked at the sky and the smoke that was moving away, and she made herself believe it. She sat down on the ground where she was standing, not because she decided to, because her legs decided for her. She sat in the dirt with the ruined burlap sack across her lap, and she stared at the ground between her boots, and she breathed, carefully, methodically, the way you breathe when breathing is the one thing you can manage. And she let the shaking come, because it was coming whether she let it or not. And shaking after was just what bodies did when they'd been asked to be braver than they were built for. Billy sat down next to her without saying anything. Then Dale. Then, one by one, the other hands who'd come off the line, until there was a row of smoke-stained, exhausted people sitting in the dirt outside the barn, and nobody speaking, and the particular silence of people who've survived something together and don't need to put it into words yet. After a while, Billy said, "I never cut a fence that fast in my life." "Felt like it," Dale said. "I think I cut through 2 posts I wasn't supposed to," Billy said. "We'll fix 'em," Dale said. A pause. "Yeah," Billy said. "We will." Clara sat between them and said nothing, and felt, in the most exhausted and unlikely way, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Ethan found her an hour later, at the well. She'd gone there to wash her face and her hands, and to stand in one place for a minute without anyone needing anything from her. And she was standing with her palms braced on the well's edge and her head down when she heard him come up behind her and stop. She straightened, turned. He looked like the fire had run straight through him and he'd run back, coat singed at the left shoulder, face dark with soot, a cut along his jaw from the debris at the lean-to that he'd apparently not noticed or hadn't gotten around to caring about. "Herd count," she said, before he could speak. "Lost 11 head to the fire line," he said. 63 made it through the creek cut. The barn's intact. The bunkhouse is intact." He paused. "The lean-to is gone, but that was already halfway to being gone anyway." She nodded. "My father's arm is going to bruise," he said. "Doc Hensley is riding out in the morning. He says it's not broken." "Good." Another pause. The well between them, the rope hanging still. "You pulled him clear," Ethan said. "You lifted the beam. You gave the order to lift it." He looked at her directly, and what was on his face now was not the careful, managed expression he usually wore, the deliberate, measured look of a man who has decided to only show what he's decided to show. This was something stripped back, something that had been simplified by the fire, the way fires simplify everything. The creek cut was your call. The wet line was your call. You were on the line from start to finish, and you didn't leave it. "Neither did anyone else," she said. "You weren't on this ranch 3 months ago," he said. "You didn't have to fight for it." She looked at the ring through the cloth of her dress, reached for it without thinking, pressed her fingers against it. Thomas's ring, her old life pressing its shape through the cloth of her new one. "I know that," she said quietly. "You chose it," he said. His voice was low, direct, with the plainness he always brought to things that mattered to him. "You didn't just work here. You chose it. Tonight. There's a difference." She looked up at him. The words sat between them in the dark,
and she felt the truth of them the way you feel the truth of something your whole body recognizes before your mind catches up. A shift in the ground beneath you, a change in where you were standing relative to everything else, and the particular disorienting clarity of realizing that, without quite knowing when, you'd started to belong somewhere. She didn't say anything, not yet. She wasn't ready to say it yet. But she didn't look away from him either, and he didn't look away from her. They stood at the well in the dark, the smoke still hanging in the distant air, the ranch quiet and intact around them. And neither of them moved, and neither of them needed to. Because some things don't need to be said the moment you feel them. Some things are better held for a beat, named slowly, on your own terms, when you're ready to say what you mean. What Clara knew, standing there with soot on her face and her shoulder aching and the ring pressed under her palm, was this: that the woman who'd slid her wedding ring across Gerald Morton's counter 3 months ago had been trying to survive, and the woman standing at this well had done something different tonight. She had fought. For this place, for these people, for a life she hadn't planned and hadn't chosen, and had somehow, without permission, started to love. She wasn't ready to say that out loud, but she knew it. She knew it the way you know the things that cost you enough to be real. Ethan turned toward the house and stopped. "Get some sleep," he said, without looking back. "My father's going to want to thank you in the morning, and it would be better if you were awake for it." She almost smiled. "He won't know how." "No," Ethan agreed. "But he'll try, and that counts for something." He walked back toward the house. Clara stood at the well a while longer. She put her hand flat against her chest, over the ring, over the place where Thomas's memory lived alongside something newer, something that didn't have a name yet, but was taking shape, quietly, carefully, like a house being built in hard ground by people who know that the foundation is the part that decides everything. She breathed the night air. She let the stars be where they were. Then she went inside. The ranch slept. But Clara Whitmore, in her room with a door that locked, lay awake for a long time. Not with grief, not with fear, but with the particular wakefulness of a person standing at the edge of something, and finally, for the first time, not looking back. Doc Hensley arrived the next morning and confirmed what Clara had already determined from the way Silas held his arm. Bruised badly. One rib cracked from the fall. Nothing broken beyond repairing. He prescribed rest in the tone of a man who knew he was prescribing something his patient had no intention of taking. And Silas sat in the kitchen chair with his arm bandaged and his jaw set, and watched Clara serve breakfast to the hands with the expression of a man who was conducting an inventory of everything he owed and hadn't paid. When the men had cleared out and the kitchen was quiet, he said, "I hear you gave the order at the lean-to." Clara refilled his coffee without being asked. "Ethan did the lifting." "Ethan told me different." Silas wrapped his good hand around the cup. "He said you came through the smoke, and you gave the count, and you didn't flinch." He paused. "My wife did that. Walked toward the noise when everybody else was walking away from it." Clara sat down across from him, something she'd never done before, always staying on the working side of the kitchen, always keeping the table as a kind of professional distance between them. She sat down now because the moment seemed to require it. "I was scared," she said. "I want you to know that. I wasn't brave in the way people mean when they say brave, like it didn't cost anything. It cost plenty." "That's the only kind of brave there is," Silas said. "The other kind is just foolishness." She looked at him. He looked back. And then he did something she had not seen him do in the 3 months she'd been at Callaway Ranch. Not at dinner, not over the account books, not in the quiet evenings when the hands were reading their primers at the kitchen table, and the ranch had a warmth to it that it hadn't had when she arrived. He said,
without any preamble or qualification. "Thank you, Clara." Her name, not Mrs. Whitmore. She felt the shift in it, and she didn't try to deflect it or minimize it. She just said, "You're welcome, Silas," and meant it entirely. He nodded once, the way Callaway men nodded when something was settled, and picked up his coffee, and that was that. But it was also, she understood, everything. In the language of this family, in the particular grammar of men who kept their important things close and unnamed until the moment required naming them, it was everything. The news about the fire reached Red Hollow by the following afternoon. Word moved fast in cattle country. Faster than rain, faster than anything except trouble. And by the time the supply rider made his regular Thursday run, the story had already been shaped by the people who hadn't been there into something that was mostly true and significantly wrong. The way stories always were. The fire was real. The Callaway Ranch saved was real. But in the version arriving back to Clara secondhand through Billy, who'd heard it at the feed store, the story had a hero, and the hero was Ethan. And the woman who'd called the creek cut and organized the wet line and dragged Silas Callaway clear of a collapsed beam had been reduced to a background detail. That widow woman he hired, which was not a surprise, and was not precisely an injustice, just the ordinary mathematics of how the world accounted for women's work. What was a surprise was Gerald Morton. He came to the ranch on a Friday, which was not a day he typically made deliveries, which meant he'd come on purpose. He arrived mid-morning, when Clara was in the kitchen and Silas was resting on the doctor's orders that he was only half following, and Ethan was out with the herd. Morton came to the back door, the kitchen door, which, in its own way, was a statement. A man coming to the door that said, "I am here to see the person who works here," rather than the front door that said, "I am here to conduct business with the owner." Clara opened it and looked at him. Gerald Morton had the expression of a man carrying something heavy that he'd carried a long way, and was finally, with some relief and some discomfort, setting down. He held his hat in his hands. He'd done that, she noticed, when he talked to her in the store. When he was sliving her ring back across the counter, he'd been holding his hat, too. She wondered if he knew he did it. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said. "Mr. Morton, I heard about the fire." He turned the hat brim through his fingers. "I heard what you did." She waited. "I wanted to say—" He stopped, tried again. "I handled things poorly. In the store. I was within my rights, but I handled it poorly. And I've thought about it since, and I wanted you to know that." Clara looked at this man who had slid her wedding ring back across the counter without meeting her eyes, who had made her feel like a problem on the day she had nothing left. And she waited to feel the satisfaction of it. The particular satisfaction of a person who's been wronged and gets to watch the wrongdoer come and say so. She didn't feel it. What she felt instead was something quieter and stranger, something closer to compassion than triumph, which surprised her. Morton was a man running a store in a drought-stricken town who'd made a calculation and made it wrong. And he'd carried the weight of it long enough to walk it out to the ranch and set it down. And that was not a small thing for a man like him to do. "I know," she said. "I appreciate you coming." His shoulders dropped half an inch with relief. "I'd like to offer you an account at the store, on credit terms, whenever you need." "That's kind," she said. "But I have wages now, and I pay my way." She paused. "If you want to do something useful, offer the same terms to the next person who comes in with nothing and needs something. Don't make them stand at your counter and feel like a problem." Morton looked at her for a long moment. "Yes, ma'am," he said, very quietly. He left, and Clara went back to the stove, and she felt, not vindicated, not triumphant, but clean. The way you feel after setting something down you've been carrying, without realizing how heavy it was. The Harvest Festival was 3 weeks after the fire. Clara had not planned to go. She had work to do, the preserves, the account books, the reading lessons that have expanded to include 2 of the Hearst hands who'd gotten wind of what she was doing, and come asking, with the careful pride of men requesting something they'd needed for years and weren't sure they'd be given. She had reasons to stay that were real and legitimate, and she used them the way people use legitimate reasons when the actual reason is something they don't want to examine. Ethan dismantled them in 30 seconds. "You're going," he said. He was standing in the kitchen doorway in the way he had, not blocking it, just present in it, occupying the frame with the loose certainty of someone who'd grown up knowing exactly where he stood in a room. "The whole crew is going. My father is going. You've been on this ranch for 3 months without a day off, and you have worked harder than any 2 of the hands combined. And you're going to the Harvest Festival, and you're going to eat something you didn't cook yourself." Clara looked at him. "You can't order me to attend a social event." "I'm not ordering you." The corner of his mouth moved, barely, the way it did when something amused him, but he'd decided not to make a production of it. "I'm informing you that there will be a wagon leaving at 4 o'clock, and I'd think poorly of anyone who made me eat Agnes Wheeler's apple cake without backup." She pressed her lips together. "Is Agnes Wheeler's apple cake that bad?" she said. "It's remarkable," he said, "in the way that disasters are remarkable." She went. Silas produced a dress that morning, folded carefully, set on the kitchen table before she came downstairs, with no note and no ceremony. Just the dress there when she arrived. Blue calico worn to a softness that said it had been loved for a long time. She'd recognized it from the portrait above the mantel in the main room, the one of a dark-haired woman in a blue dress standing outside this very house, 10 years younger and 10 years whole. She stood at the kitchen table with the dress in her hands for a long moment. Then she climbed the stairs and put it on. And when she looked in the cracked mirror above the wash basin, she looked like someone who had somewhere to be. The festival was in the center of Red Hollow, lanterns strung between the buildings, tables hauled out into the street, the particular festive noise of a small town that has survived another season and is celebrating the fact with music and bad cake and a collective exhale. The Callaway crew arrived together and spread out in the comfortable way of men who've spent enough time together that they don't need to stay in a group to stay connected. Clara felt the town notice her. It was not subtle. The women near the quilting table, the men by the pie stand, the general drift of attention that follows a newcomer or a known quantity whose status has changed. She felt all of it. And she squared her shoulders inside Ethan's mother's blue dress and walked to where Silas had stopped to speak to his neighbor Hearst. And she stood there, and she was exactly who she was. The whispers came in waves. She caught pieces. "The widow Callaway hired. That's her, the one who ran the fire line. Saved Silas himself, they say. But did you hear? She was the one in Morton's store trying to sell her ring for—" That one landed. She felt it land. She didn't flinch. What happened next she didn't expect. Martha Hearst, 50-something, solid as a fence post, with the no-nonsense bearing of a woman who'd been running a cattle operation beside her husband for 3 decades, walked directly to Clara, bypassing the gossip and the whispers and the careful social triangulation of small-town festivals, and took her hand and shook it like a man. "You're the one who came up with the creek cut plan," Martha said. It was not a question. "Ethan made the call," Clara said. "Ethan told my husband it was your idea and your timing," Martha said. "And my husband told me, and I'm telling you, that was solid thinking under pressure, and you should know that somebody noticed." She let go of her hand and looked at her with the direct appraisal of a woman who'd spent a long time not being noticed herself. "You planning to stay at Calloway's?" "That's up to Mr. Calloway," Clara said carefully. "Is it?" Martha said, in a tone that suggested she had a different view of that particular situation, and moved on. Clara stood where she was for a moment. Then she heard her name from a different direction. She almost didn't recognize the voice, because it was the last voice she expected in this place. But she turned, and there was Rourke Talley. He was standing at the edge of the festival crowd, not in it, leaning against the wall of the hardware store, with a drink in his hand, and that particular studied stillness she remembered, watching her with the eyes that never quite matched whatever expression he was wearing over them. Her pulse kicked once, hard. She looked around, automatic, not panicked, and saw Ethan 30 feet away, talking to a young man she didn't recognize, his back to her. She calculated the distance and the crowd between them, and decided she was not going to summon help like a woman who needed rescuing. Not from this. She walked toward Rourke instead. He pushed off the wall as she came closer. A little surprised. She saw it, the small adjustment in his expression that said he'd expected her to look away or look for help, not come to him. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said. "Mr. Talley?" She stopped at a conversation distance. Not too close, not the distance of fear. "I didn't expect to see you here." "Free country." He swirled his drink. "Heard about the fire. Heard you played quite the hero." "I did my job," she said. "Funny how your job keeps expanding." His voice carried the same smooth edge it always had. But there was something different underneath it tonight. Something that wasn't the calculated menace she'd catalogued. Something closer to frustration. Like a man who'd come to town expecting one thing and found another. "You went from cook to bookkeeper to fire captain in what, 3 months? That's ambitious for a widow who came begging for bread." She looked at him steadily. "I wasn't begging. I was offering fair trade." "At Morton's store," he said. "With your dead husband's ring." He watched her face for the flinch. "I know the whole story, not just the parts the Calloways told." "So does everyone," Clara said. "Including me. I was there." She held his gaze. "I notice it doesn't embarrass me anymore, Mr. Talley. I had to think about why that is." She paused. "I think it's because I'm not ashamed of having been desperate. Desperate and surviving is not the same as weak. The people who know the difference are worth knowing. The ones who don't..." She let that finish itself. Rourke was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, the edge was still there, but something in it had shifted. Something she couldn't quite read yet. "You really think you belong there?" he said. "At that ranch?" "I think I earned my place there," she said. "Same as anyone." "And Ethan?" His eyes moved past her shoulder, and she knew without looking that Ethan had seen them and was moving. "You think that's just business?" She didn't answer that. Not because she didn't have an answer, but because some things weren't Rourke Talley's to know. "Goodbye, Mr. Talley," she said. "I hope you find work that suits you." She turned away from him at exactly the moment Ethan arrived beside her, and she saw him read the situation in one glance. Rourke's position, her posture, the distance between them. And she said, quietly, before he could speak, "It's done. Leave it." Ethan looked at her. "I handled it," she said. A beat. Then he nodded, once, and turned away from Rourke without giving him the satisfaction of a confrontation. And that, she realized, was exactly right. That was the smartest and most dismissive thing he could have done. And the fact that he'd followed her lead without argument settled something in her chest that had been unsettled all evening. They walked back into the festival together, not side by side in any deliberate way, just in the natural way of two people moving in the same direction at the same pace, which is its own kind of closeness. It was Billy who started it. He'd had 2 cups of the festival cider, which was stronger than it tasted, and he was standing on the wagon bed, doing an impression of Dale, trying to read the primer that was accurate enough to be unkind, and funny enough that Dale himself was laughing, and the laughter pulled people in the way real laughter always does. Unperformed, unforced, the sound of people who've been through something hard together and come out the other side and found they like each other there. Clara stood at the edge of it and felt the warmth of it move through her like the first real heat of spring through cold ground. Silas was at her left shoulder. She felt him there before she heard him. "She wore that dress to the festival in 2009, he said quietly. Not sad, exactly. Something more complicated than sad. The tone of a man who has decided to carry his grief openly, rather than hiding it. She'd want you to have it. I should have said that this morning when I left it." Clara reached up and touched the collar of the blue dress. "You didn't need to say it," she said. "I understood." He was quiet for a moment. The laughter from the wagon rolled over them both. "Ethan's a good man," Silas said then, in the same quiet voice. The non sequitur was not a non sequitur, and they both knew it. "Better than I was at his age. Better than I am now, in some ways." Clara said nothing. "He doesn't say things he doesn't mean," Silas went on. "Never has. When he was 12 years old, he told me this ranch needed better drainage, and he was right, and I argued with him for a year before I put the drainage in." A pause. When he says something matters to him, it does, without condition. Clara turned her head and looked at Silas Calloway. He was looking at the wagon, at Billy still performing, at the circle of laughing men who were his crew and his responsibility, and his family in the way that ranch families are families, made by proximity and shared work, and the particular bond of people who've kept each other alive. He didn't look at her, but he didn't need to. She looked back at the wagon. She found Ethan in the crowd. He'd moved to the edge of the circle, leaning against a fence post, watching her with an expression that he probably thought was less legible than it was. She held his gaze for a moment across the noise and the lantern light and the distance between them, and neither of them looked away, and neither of them smiled. And it was somehow more honest than a smile would have been. Just 2 people who had been through a fire together, who had sat with numbers at a kitchen table and stood at a well in the dark, who had each been keeping their most important things carefully in their hands, discovering that the other person had been doing the same. She reached up to her collar. The ribbon was there, the one she'd threaded through the ring, the one she wore close to her chest. She touched it once, the way she always did when she needed something to hold on to. Thomas's ring, Thomas's memory, the weight of what had been real and good and lost. She did not let go of it, but for the first time it felt like something she was carrying by choice rather than necessity, something she was keeping, not something that was keeping her. A carried memory rather than an anchor. A part of herself she'd decided to take forward rather than leave behind. That was the difference. And standing in the middle of Red Hollow's Harvest Festival, in a dead woman's blue dress, with the man she'd come to trust watching her from across the crowd, and the man who'd built this ranch standing quietly at her shoulder, Clara Whitmore understood, finally, fully, without argument, that surviving was not the same as living. She had been surviving for 8 months. She had been living for 3 weeks. The question that came next, the question that Ethan's gaze was asking, that Silas's words had been asking, that the ranch itself seemed to be asking every morning when she woke up in her room with the door that locked, was whether she was ready to stop treating those 2 things as the same. She turned to Silas. "I'd like to stay," she said. not just as cook. I'd like to manage the accounts properly, oversee the hiring, keep the reading lessons going." She paused. "If that's agreeable." Silas Calloway looked at her for a long moment with those heavy, seasoned eyes.
"It's agreeable," he said. He didn't say anything else. He walked back toward the wagon where his men were laughing, and he stopped at its edge and crossed his arms and watched them with the expression of a man counting what he had and finding it, against all odds, sufficient. Clara stayed where she was. Ethan came to her a few minutes later, moving through the crowd without hurrying, the way he always moved, like a man who knew where he was going. He stopped beside her. "My father talked to you?" he said. "A little," she said. A pause. "And?" he said. She looked at him directly, at the cut on his jaw still healing, at the singed coat collar he hadn't bothered to replace, at the eyes that said things his mouth waited to confirm. "I told him I'd stay," she said. Something moved through his expression, quick, unguarded, real. Then he nodded. "Good," he said. The word was simple. The way he said it was not simple at all. They stood together as the festival moved around them, and the lanterns burned, and the music started up somewhere further down the street, fiddle, clumsy and bright. And the night settled over Red Hollow with the particular quality of nights that will be remembered. Not because great things happened in them, but because the small, quiet things that decided everything happened in them instead. She had come to this town with a ring and no options. She was leaving this festival with something harder to name and worth more than gold. She was leaving it with a future. She just had to be brave enough to step all the way into it. Spring came to Red Hollow the way good things come after long waiting. Not with announcement, not with ceremony, just with the quiet insistence of something that had decided to arrive and was done being delayed. Clara felt it first in the kitchen garden. The onion sets she'd planted in hard ground back in her first week, the ones she'd broken the soil for with Dale's pickaxe, inch by careful inch, when she was still a woman with nothing but 2 hands and a refusal to stop, had come through the winter and were pushing up green and certain in the March soil. And she stood over them one morning with her coffee going cold in her hand, and felt something in her chest that she couldn't name for a moment until she recognized it. Pride. Clean, unqualified, uncomplicated pride. Not the brittle kind she'd carried into Morton's store, the pride of a person holding themselves together by sheer force of will. This was different. This was the pride of someone who had planted something in bad conditions and watched it grow anyway, and knew exactly what it had cost. "Talking to the onions again?" Billy called from the direction of the barn. "They respond better than most people," she called back. He laughed, that unguarded laugh he'd developed over the winter, the one that had started as a rare thing and become ordinary, the way good things became ordinary when they were allowed to stay long enough. Ordinary, Clara had decided, was deeply underrated. The banknote was settled in full on the 15th of March. Silas rode back from town with the receipt in his coat pocket and said nothing about it at dinner. Just ate his meal with a quality of stillness that was different from his usual stillness. Lighter somehow, like a man who has been bracing against something for a long time and has finally been allowed to stop. It was Ethan who mentioned it near the end of the meal, and the table received the news with the quiet satisfaction of people who had all worked toward it and knew it. Dale refilled his own coffee. "Good," he said. That was the whole of the celebration, but every man at that table knew what it meant. The ranch was clear. The ranch was theirs. Silas looked at Clara across the table. He didn't raise a glass. They weren't a glass-raising family. But he held her gaze for a moment and in the economy of that gaze was everything that needed saying about whose numbers had made this possible. Whose early mornings and late evenings over the account books had turned a 60-day crisis into a managed solution. She gave him a small nod. He gave her one back. That was their language, the two of them, and it was sufficient. What she hadn't expected, what blindsided her entirely on a Tuesday morning 3 weeks into spring, was the letter from Thomas's brother. It came with the regular post, handwritten in the cramped formal script of a man who wrote few letters and made each one count. Robert Whitmore, 20 years older than Thomas had been, a banker in St. Louis, who disapproved of his younger brother's choice of profession and his choice of wife in roughly equal measure. Clara had met him twice, once at the wedding, once at the funeral, and both times he'd looked at her with the careful assessment of a man pricing something he didn't intend to buy. She read the letter at the kitchen table, alone, before anyone else was up. Robert Whitmore was writing to inform her that Thomas's small life insurance policy, the one she'd been told by the railroad company was null due to unpaid premiums, had in fact been paid. The railroad company had made an administrative error. The policy had paid out to the estate. Since there were no children, the estate belonged to Clara. The amount was not a fortune, but it was more than she'd had when she walked into Morton's store. It was more than enough. She sat with the letter in her hands for a long time. The kitchen was quiet. The ranch was still in that particular pre-dawn stillness that she'd come to know like a person. Its breathing, its sounds, the way it settled and resettled before the day started. She'd been here 6 months. She knew this place the way you know a place you've worked and worried over and fought for. From the inside, with your hands, with the parts of yourself that don't come out except when something real is asked of them. The letter changed nothing. That was what hit her. Sitting there in the early morning with money she'd thought was gone returned to her like a door opening back. It changed nothing. Not the account she'd organized, not the garden she'd planted, not the men she'd taught to read, not the fire she'd helped fight, not the ranch she'd decided, standing at a well in the dark with soot on her face, that she'd chosen. But it changed something in her, because she could leave now. She had means. She had options. She had, for the first time since Thomas died, the material freedom to go somewhere else and start over with something real in her pocket. And she sat in that kitchen as the pre-dawn became dawn and the ranch started making its waking up sounds. And she asked herself the question she hadn't let herself ask until now. Asked it honestly, the way you have to ask the things that matter. If you could go, would you? The answer came before she finished the question. No. Not maybe. Not, I'm not sure yet. Not the hedged, careful no of a woman who was staying because she had nowhere else to go. No, clearly, because this was where she intended to be. She told Ethan about the letter that evening. She told him because it was the right thing to do. Because he'd offered her work, and she'd taken it in desperation. And now the nature of that had changed, and he deserved to know. She wasn't going to let him think she was here because she had no other option. Not anymore. He listened without interrupting, the way he always did. His eyes didn't change while she read him the relevant parts. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "You're telling me this because you could leave," he said. "Yes." "And you're not leaving?" "No." He looked at her across the kitchen table. The same table where they'd gone over account books, where she'd told him about Rourke, where Billy had learned to read his mother's letters for the first time. This table had accumulated more of their history than she'd noticed while it was happening. "I want to renegotiate the terms," she said. Something shifted in his expression. "What terms?" "My terms here." She folded the letter and set it flat on the table. I'm not just the cook. I haven't been just the cook for months. I manage the accounts. I oversee the supply ordering. I run the reading lessons. I want those responsibilities acknowledged formally. Not because I need the acknowledgement, but because if I'm going to do work that matters to this ranch, I want it to exist as real work, not as extra things a hired woman happens to do that nobody has a name for. Ethan looked at her for a long moment. What would you call it? He said. Ranch manager, she said, or something like it. Your father's the one who decides that. I'll talk to him if you think it's appropriate. I think it's appropriate, Ethan said. He said it immediately, without hesitation, the way he said things he'd already decided. I also think... He stopped. She looked at him. He looked at the table for a moment, and it was so rare, that look, the almost uncertain thing that crossed his face so briefly she almost missed it. This man who was direct about everything and apparently found one topic harder than the rest. Then he looked up. I think, he said, that the job title is the smaller conversation. The kitchen was very quiet. Is it? Clara said. You know it is, he said. Not pressing, not advancing, just naming the thing they'd both been careful around for months. The way careful people name things when they finally decided that naming them is less dangerous than not. She touched the ribbon at her collar. Thomas's ring, underneath the cloth, familiar and warm. She'd been carrying it for 6 months. She knew its weight the way you know the weight of something you've decided to keep. I'm not the woman who came here in October, she said. I know, he said. I've changed. What I'm willing to want has changed. She pressed her fingers flat against the ribbon. I'm not going to rush anything or pretend the road to get here was simple. It wasn't simple. No, he agreed. It wasn't. But I'm not going anywhere, she said. I want you to know that clearly. Whatever happens next, I'm here because I chose to be here, not because I have nowhere else to go. Ethan looked at her with that stripped-back expression, the one the fire had first uncovered, the one that lived underneath all his careful management and showed up only when something real required it. That's all I needed to know, he said. And that was it. No grand declaration, no sweeping gesture, no words that tried to be bigger than the moment. Just two people at a kitchen table agreeing, plainly, directly, in the language they'd both built over 6 months of hard work and harder honesty. That what was between them was real, and was chosen, and was going to be treated accordingly. Clara exhaled. She hadn't known she'd been holding that breath for 6 months until she let it go. The woman arrived on a Thursday in late April. Clara saw her from the yard, a figure on the road from Red Hollow, on foot, carrying a bag that was too heavy for the way she was walking, which was the walk of a person who had been walking a long time on insufficient food. Clara knew that walk. She'd had it herself. She went to the gate. The woman was younger than Clara had been in October, maybe 20, maybe younger, with a face that had the particular quality of someone who has been crying recently and has run out of tears and is now operating purely on forward motion. She stopped when she saw Clara. She looked at the house behind her. She looked like a woman working up to asking something she wasn't sure she had the right to ask. Are you Mrs. Whitmore? She said. They said in town, a woman at the Callaway Ranch, I was told... She stopped. Tried again. I don't have any money. My husband died 2 months ago, and I have been trying to find work, and I can't. Her voice caught. She pressed past it. I'm not asking for charity. I can work. I'm willing to work for anything. Clara looked at her. She looked at this young woman, thin, proud, frightened, standing straight despite all of it,
and she felt the recognition move through her like a bell struck, resonant and clear. The recognition of a woman seeing herself 6 months back, before the wagon, and the kitchen, and the fire, and the table, and everything that had been built since. She opened the gate. "Come in," she said. The young woman's face did the thing faces do when relief arrives after long absence. Not quite tears, not quite a smile. Something rawer than either. "I'm Nora," she said. "Clara." She took the bag from her. "Have you eaten today?" Nora shook her head. "All right," Clara said. "Come inside. We'll start there." She walked Nora through the gate and across the yard toward the kitchen door. And she thought about October, about a counter and a ring, and a shopkeeper who couldn't look at her while he was turning her away. She thought about a wagon and a long ride, and a kitchen that needed reorganizing, and a man who'd said, "We don't need gold. We need you," with the directness of someone who simply meant it. She thought about what it had meant to be received by that, what it had built in her, what it had cost, and what it had returned. She held the kitchen door open. "We don't have a position open right now," Clara said, "but we'll find the work. We always do." Nora looked at her in the kitchen doorway with the expression of a person trying to decide if something real is actually happening to them. "Why?" she said. The same question. The question that came out of a person when they'd been turned away enough times that kindness required explanation. Clara recognized it in her bones. "Because 6 months ago," she said, "somebody opened a door for me when I had nothing, and I intend to spend a long time making sure that wasn't wasted." She went to the stove. She put the kettle on. She fed the girl. By summer, the ranch had expanded in ways that had nothing to do with cattle. 2 new families had settled on the land adjacent to the Callaway spread. Drawn partly by the water access the Hearst arrangement had stabilized, partly by the word that had moved through the territory about a ranch that was fair, that paid on time, that had a woman running the books who knew what she was doing, and a foreman who treated his men like people worth keeping. The reading lessons had become a regular evening fixture that other families wrote in for. Clara had started a correspondence with a school administrator in the county seat about what it would take to get a proper school teacher out to the territory, and the response had been more encouraging than she'd expected. Nora was still there. Turned out she had a gift for numbers that Clara had spotted in the first week, and she'd started teaching her the account work with the same directness that someone had once used to teach Clara that her skills were worth real wages. Nora bent over the ledger at the kitchen table now with the focused expression of a young woman learning that she is more capable than she was told, which was the most satisfying thing Clara had found to watch since she'd started watching Billy sound out the words in his mother's letters. Silas gave Clara the title of ranch manager in May, formally, in front of the crew, with a quiet ceremony of a man who understood that naming something mattered. Dale had nodded once, definitively, like a man confirming a thing he'd already decided was true months ago. Billy had started to whoop and thought better of it under Dale's glance, and swallowed it down to a wide grin instead. Ethan had said nothing. He hadn't needed to. What they were to each other was building the way good things build, without rushing, without performing, with the patience of 2 people who had both learned the cost of things that fell apart and were committed to doing this one right. He'd asked her, on a May evening at the kitchen table, if she'd consider a different kind of permanence when she was ready, and she'd told him she'd tell him when she was, and that answer had satisfied him, because he was a man who understood that not yet was not the same as no, and who was willing to wait for the real answer rather than push for an early one. She was getting there. She was nearly there. On a July evening, she went to her room and opened the small box she kept at the back of her drawer, and she took out the ribbon. Thomas's ring on its ribbon, the one she'd worn against her chest for 8 months. and she held it in both hands in the last light coming through the window. She sat with it for a long time. She sat with the memory of Thomas, his crooked smile, his optimism, the particular goodness of a man who had loved her cleanly and well and been taken too soon. She didn't try to diminish it, or replace it, or tuck it into a corner where it wouldn't interfere with anything new. She sat with it fully, the way you sit with something that was real and true and is now past, honoring the weight of it honestly. Then she took the ring off the ribbon. She held the ring in one hand and the ribbon in the other. She opened the small wooden box that had belonged to Ethan's mother, the one Silas had given her quietly in June, saying his wife had kept her important things in it, and there was no reason it should sit empty. She set Thomas's ring inside it, in the velvet interior, where it sat solidly and undeniably and beautifully. A thing that had been real, kept as real, honored and set down with both hands, not discarded, not buried, carried forward into a box made by someone else's love, in a house that had been built by people who believed that the things you made with your hands and your choices were worth fighting for. She closed the box. She sat for a moment more. Then she stood up, and she went downstairs, and she walked out into the July evening where Ethan was standing at the fence post, looking at the range that was green now. Actually green, the drought 2 seasons behind them, and she came and stood beside him. He looked at her. She looked at him. She said, "I'm ready." He understood her immediately, the way he always understood her, directly, without needing her to say more than she'd said. The corner of his mouth moved, that barely there thing that meant more on his face than a full smile on someone else's. "You sure?" he said. "I've been sure for a while," she said. "I was just finishing something first." He nodded. He turned toward her fully, and in the evening light, with the green ranch behind him and the sky going pink and orange over the territory they had both fought for in different ways and were both standing in now, Ethan Calloway looked at Clara Whitmore the way a man looks at something he had the good sense to recognize and the patience not to ruin. "Then we'll do this right," he said. "Yes," she said. "We will." And they did. In a world that had told her she was worth no more than the gold on her finger, Clara Whitmore had proven that the only currency that ever built anything lasting was this: the willingness to stay, to work, to choose, again and again, in the hard ground, in the smoke, in the quiet honesty of a kitchen table, the life worth having over the life worth mourning. She had come to Red Hollow with a ring and no options. She built something there that outlasted them both. And gold, as it turned out, had never been the point. The people were. They always were.